You know, when I came to this country, everybody told me, Arnie, you're too ambitious, you're too different. But you learn something powerful, bold moves get results. Today I want to talk about one bold move. Not some Hollywood stunt, not muscle in the gym, but a maneuver on the world stage that sent shockwaves through the corridors of power. A move by India, yes, India that humiliated the United States, not by bombs or missiles, but by sheer strategy, audacity, and national will. And listen, this isn't about hate. This is about history, about how one country showed what can happen when you decide you will no longer dance to someone else's tune. Imagine Washington confident, striding on the global chessboard, used to being the mover, the shaker, the final decision maker. Imagine policy wonks, diplomats, generals, all believing that US opinion equated to global opinion. Now imagine that somewhere on the other side of the planet, in New Delhi, the leaders quietly prepare. They don't make threats, they don't launch warnings, they move, and the move is bold, it's clean, it's precise, it reorders assumptions. Here's how it happened. For decades, India had acted like a rising power, yes, but more cautious than daring, leaning toward non-alignment, balancing relationships with the US, Russia, China, maintaining its space. Everyone expected India to play nice, to maintain existing power structures. But a decision was made, let's say a major infrastructure project, a major strategic partnership or foreign policy treaty, that explicitly rejected US demands, or expectations, or even pressure, something that went completely against what Washington wanted, and yet India did it anyway. You see, the humiliation doesn't come from confrontation, it comes from upset expectations, from the US being used to saying, we want X effect, or we'll withhold aid, or we'll sanction, and others saying, okay sir, but India said no, and India did something the US counted against. Maybe it was a defense pact with Russia or China. Maybe it was energy independence from fossil fuels controlled by Western corporations. Maybe it was refusing to follow a sanctions regime. Maybe it was welcoming projection of power in the Indian Ocean in a way that excluded American logistics. Whatever the specifics, the essence is the same. India said, our national interest first, and the US had to swallow it, had to adjust. You know, humiliation in international affairs is like losing the gym competition. It's public. People see it. It weakens you not because you were defeated in battle, but because your prestige, your influence, the thing you assumed was unchallenged, was exposed as vulnerable. When India made that bold move, when Delhi stood its ground with resolve, Washington's infallibility, that myth cracked. And once a crack appears in the structure of perceived dominance, everyone starts eyeing that crack. What does humiliation look like on the world stage? First, the diplomats stop smiling. The briefings in Washington become defensive. Journalists start writing about decline, about losing South Asia, about losing strategic sway. Allies begin to question if India can stand up. Who else might? And adversaries, oh, they see opportunity. They smell power shifting. India's move didn't just change a policy. It rewrote expectations. It signaled India will not kowtow to pressure. India will make its own alliances. India will chart its own course, economically, militarily, diplomatically. And the US, which had grown accustomed to being at the center of decision-making, was suddenly off-center. India didn't ask for permission. India didn't wait for approval. So many of America's calculations on supply chains, on regional order, on military basing, were thrown off balance. Let's talk specifics. Suppose India signed a long-term agreement with a large power that Washington distrusts. Maybe because of geopolitical rivalry, India accepts investment in ports, infrastructure, tech. The US protests, you risk our strategic interests, you risk your autonomy, but India goes ahead. And as it does, the US has to respond. Either antagonize India and risk pushing it closer to rivals, or accept it and lose some leverage. That's humiliation, because the US rhetoric about being the indispensable partner, the one-choice ally, begins to feel like rhetoric only. Now consider trade. Suppose India refuses to follow US trade restrictions. Suppose India implements policies favoring domestic industry, restricting certain imports, demanding technology transfers, investing in indigenous production of semiconductors, defense, clean energy. Suppose India curtails its dependence on US suppliers, while diversifying its partners. Washington pressures with sanctions or diplomacy, but India weathers that, keeps moving. At some point global corporations begin to realize India's market is growing too fast to ignore. They adjust supply chains, decisions, sourcing, not because the US asked, but because the economics are there. That's humiliation. America's influence, once assumed, once given, is no longer taken for granted. Then there's public perception. Indians celebrate. Their leaders gain domestic popularity for asserting independence. International media starts writing. India emerges as counterweight. Think tanks produce reports about the decline in US influence in Asia. Allies in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East begin reconsidering. Is it better to align with US or India? Because India has shown it won't be bullied, and that image matters. Power is not just tanks and carriers. Power is belief. The belief everyone else has that you can make things happen. When that belief shifts, the humiliation has done its job. I remember in business, in bodybuilding, when someone thinks you'll back down, but you don't. That moment changes everything. India's leaders recognized that moment. They had been preparing for years, building infrastructure, investing in defense, growing economy, reforming laws, cultivating new partners. But the bold move they struck when alignment with global shifts made it possible. Maybe the US was distracted. Maybe burdened by overextension, maybe global supply chain stresses, technological competition, climate pressures, all that created space. India seized it. Now think of Washington scrambling. Intelligence analysts had to go back to the drawing board. Foreign policy strategists had to craft new contingencies. Allies like Japan, Australia, Saudi Arabia, maybe even European powers, had to assess what does this mean for US reliability, for US strategy. Could the US still count on India as it had? Because India had just shown its interests come first, no longer playing second fiddle. That rips apart certain alliances, causes diplomatic tension. It compels the US to negotiate from a position less sure. That is the mark of humiliation, not a defeat in war, but a defeat in narrative. Losing the narrative is more damaging than losing a battle. Humiliation also means economic cost. Suppose India pivots toward other currencies in its trade, bypassing the dollar. Suppose India makes deals in rupees or strengthens financial relations with partners, also unwilling to be tied to US economic dominance. The US sees some erosion of dollar influence, some weakening of financial leverage. That's painful, because many of America's tools, sanctions, aid, trade agreements, rely on financial levers. If those are less powerful, then the big line is less scary. Moreover, in technology, maybe India opens access to certain systems, or blocks certain technologies that the US was counting on controlling. Maybe India permits certain foreign tech firms that Washington opposes, or rejects agreements that serve US intelligence goals. When India says, we decide who comes in, who we partner with, that sends shivers, because so much of global tech architecture, satellites, data, telecom, has become intertwined with national security. If India picks partners outside US orbit, that shifts ecosystems, and ecosystems are hard to re-engineer. The effect is cumulative. Every action chips away at assumptions. The US, used to thinking of India as a strategic partner that would reliably align, finds that India now has strategic autonomy, and autonomy doesn't need confrontation, it needs presence. And that presence, India's increasing presence, is what humiliated the US, in a manner more lasting than any skirmish. Now maybe you wonder, was it wrong for India? No, it was wise, because in a world of shifting power, technological change, climate crisis, multipolarity, you can't rely on past dominance. You must build your own capacity, your own leverage. India's bold move taught a lesson that a nation does not have to be the strongest militarily to assert itself. It must be consistent, committed, innovative, and when it picks the right moment, the right partners, the right policies, it can reorder relations, reset expectations, shake giants. The United States isn't destroyed. The world still listens. But now, respect is no longer automatic. The US has to earn it. Each time, with policy, with values, with follow-through, because now it faces a country that will say our way, our choice, sovereignty, and the biggest humiliation is not being defeated, it's being overtaken in moral authority, in diplomatic weight, and in perception. So when the story is told, years from now, people will say that was the moment India refused to conform, the moment it looked directly at the expectations of the global superpower, and said not with arrogance, not with recklessness, but with calm, unwavering confidence, we will decide our future, not you. That was the moment India stepped out from the shadows, not as a rising power trying to please everyone, but as a sovereign force that had earned its place at the table, and not just a place, but a place it carved for itself, with years of deliberate moves, strategic patience and hard choices. The West didn't see it coming, not because it was hidden, but because they didn't believe India would ever stop playing the balancing act. They thought India would forever be the swing vote, the hesitant middle, the fence-sitter. But India wasn't hesitating, it was preparing. When the assumptions fell, the world paused, and not because a war broke out or a treaty collapsed. No, it paused because the narrative shifted, and narratives, my friend, are more powerful than any missile. Narratives define who has momentum, who calls the shots, who sets the agenda. And for decades, America had the narrative, protector of democracy, architect of global order, economic engine of the free world. But now, here was India, young, confident, nuclear capable, technologically advancing, saying we don't need to ask for permission anymore. And in that moment, America realized, it doesn't dictate outcomes in South Asia the way it used to, not even close. The old playbook, outdated. The Cold War logic, gone. The idea that US pressure automatically bends regional players, broken. Because India didn't just ignore the pressure, it outgrew it. And here's the thing people forget: power isn't about domination, it's about direction. The power to choose your path, to define your priorities, to say yes or no. That is true sovereignty. And when India made its move, whether it was refusing to follow Western sanctions, or signing strategic deals with Russia, or asserting control over critical technologies, it wasn't about poking the US in the eye. It was about saying this is what's best for us, and we are strong enough to do it. See, we gotta understand, power is not zero-sum. When someone else rises, it doesn't mean you have to fall. But dominance demands recognition. If you've been the loudest voice in the room for 75 years, and suddenly someone else speaks in a tone that commands the same respect, that feels like humiliation, not because you're weaker, but because you're no longer the only one people listen to. And that's what happened. India didn't shout, it didn't threaten, it didn't issue ultimatums, it simply acted. It didn't follow the script. It wrote a new one, a script where alliances are flexible, where policies are made in New Delhi, not imposed from Washington or Brussels, a script where India isn't just the biggest democracy, it's one of the shrewdest strategic players in the game. Let's be honest, this wasn't some emotional outburst or a one-time stunt, this was calculated, strategic, the culmination of a long game. India had studied the board, watched the players, bided its time. It had invested in domestic manufacturing, cut its dependence on volatile imports, modernized its military, forged new trade routes, built digital infrastructure that rivaled any Western nation. And when the moment came to make the bold move, India didn't hesitate, it simply moved, and the world felt it. This is what the US didn't expect, not that India could do it, but that it would, because for so long, everyone assumed India was still in the phase of catching up. They forgot that ambition doesn't always roar, sometimes it waits, and when it rises, it's not with a bang, it's with a steady, unstoppable march forward. And now, the US can't ignore it. The calculus has changed. Every negotiation, every treaty, every strategic dialogue, India now walks in not as the junior partner, but as an equal, maybe even in some cases, the one with more leverage. Because when you've shown the world that you're willing to say no, that you're not afraid to walk your own road, you earn a different kind of respect, not the kind that's handed out by headlines or think tanks, but the kind that shapes how others deal with you. And sometimes, the most powerful move is not to attack, not to provoke, but to assert quietly, with resolve, something unavoidable. India did that, and the world and the US could do nothing but watch.